Lot to say, so I'll just do the introduction now. I'm Amanda Gillis-Furutaka. I work at Kyoto Sangyo University with Tom Robb and a number of other people who are here. And I'd like to talk today about our extensive reading program and research I've been doing into why our extensive readers are in fact extensive translators into English, from Japanese to English to Japanese. So we started our extensive reading program a long time ago, and there's going to be another session a little later this afternoon to tell you about that. Until April 2013, we had about 3,000 students doing extensive reading. I work in the Department of English, and my students are English majors. The students doing extensive reading borrow their books from the university library, and we use the Moodle Reader, M-Reader now, is a way of evaluating how many words they have read. The students are given a target number of words to read each semester, and if they reach the target, then they get 20% of their final course grade for that. The students that I'm talking about this afternoon, the student population that I was sampling are the general English program students from 8 faculties who are taking required English classes, so not the English majors. But the English majors do extensive reading too. 2 years ago, I did a small research project into extensive reading based on interview method to find out why some readers were really taking off on the program and others just never got started. And what emerged from that, as it does in interesting research, is not what I expected. The ones that were struggling, and even the good readers, told me that they were spending a lot of time translating. And so the extensive reading was really exhausting for them, very tiring, because they were reading everything twice. And so I thought, well, this is really interesting. I've got to find out more about what's going on.
Excuse me, Amanda, but I don't know which file is yours.
Ah, it's it's in the folder. There are an awful lot of files in here. Do we have a mouse?
Yes, right here.
Okay. It's in presentations. Here we are. And here we are. Okay. Right, we're in business. Right. Well, we've done this. And it's a little speed reading for you here, and I've just explained the background, how I got interested in this matter. So my current research questions are: in what circumstances do students feel the need to translate into their L1 when reading a graded reader? And the Holy Grail: is there a level of reading ability beyond which the students no longer need to translate into their L1 when reading graded readers at a suitable level? And the way I've gone about this, we were very lucky because until last year, at the beginning of this year, we had 2,500 students taking required extensive reading as part of their required English program, and they all had to take a final test. And so we had a captive survey group, and we added 8 questions to the end of their final test, and so we were able to get quite a lot of data from this. 3 of those questions were directly related to this research question. At the same time, I'm somewhat distrustful of quantitative research and data. I'm very much a qualitative person. I decided that to get to the bottom of this, I needed to talk to the students, and I needed for them to go through the process of reading part of a graded reader and tell me when they were needing to switch into Japanese. And so this is what I did with 30 students. And I'll explain the process in a little more detail a bit later. So, first of all, we ended up with 2,464 first-year students taking the final test. And so they took the multiple-choice survey questions at the end of their test. Just to reiterate, the student cohort had done extensive reading for a whole year by this time. And some of the questions in our survey were related to reading habits in Japanese, and we wanted to see if we could correlate certain aspects of reading habits with extensive reading ability and progress and enthusiasm. We also wanted to research flow, but I'm not going to talk about those results today. So, my first question, when you started the extensive reading program in April, how often did you translate what you read into Japanese? I hope you can see the numbers. Now, the top row across, words read in thousands. So 0 to 49 means 0 to 49,000 words that they read, 4,900 words that they read. No, 150,000. No, 0 to 49,000 words that they read during that whole year. Okay, and then the middle band, 50 to 149,000, and then 150,000 plus. So going from left to right, we've got the low motivated, the ones that didn't read much, the middle range, and then the readers, as I've called the more diligent readers. So the 8 things they could check. Either every sentence, they translated every sentence, 1 or 2 times a page, once every 3 to 5 words, once every 6 to 20 pages, a few times a book, almost never, and they didn't translate at all, they'd read directly in English. And the figures say it all, don't they? Even the enthusiastic readers on the right were translating as much as everybody else, and frequently every sentence, or once or twice a page. The next question, discussion. Okay, I've just said it. Yeah, so there was a lot of translating going on, and the frequency with which they were translating was the same across the board. So, bottom point, translating what they read as they go seems to be a very common way of approaching extensive reading at the start of the program for all students. So the next question now, when you are reading an extensive reading book, how often do you translate into Japanese? So this was January, they started in April, this was January. We can see an improvement that, in fact, they are translating a little less, but basically the bottom line is they were still translating a lot. And even the most diligent readers were still translating very frequently. Most encouraging of all in my discussion is we can say that, if you look at the tables on the handout as well, the most diligent readers were translating less frequently towards the end of the course than the middle range and certainly the lowest motivated readers. But the results also indicate that even after a year, translating was the norm for most of the students. Question 8. Why do you translate into Japanese when you're reading in English? Check the reasons that apply to you. On this table graph, you can't see the reasons. I'll come to those in a minute. What you can see is there's a big spike at number 4 and number 7. The reasons were we'd done a pilot survey with English majors in their second year of extensive reading, and we asked them to list the reasons why they translate, and then we took the most common reasons and then put them into our survey. So, the most common reason for translating when students didn't understand is to get the meaning of a sentence, often at sentence level, not the word level. And the next most common reason was to understand the narrative flow of the story. I think that's quite interesting because they were translating because they didn't want to lose the thread of the story. That was very important for them. Possibly for two reasons. Optimistically, we could say they were enjoying the story and they were into it. But realistically, they have, with Moodle Reader, they have a comprehension quiz at the end, and they have to get 6 out of 10 questions correct to be awarded the number of words for that book and for them to reach their target and get the grades for that class. So it is very important for them to understand the flow of the narrative. Third most common reason, when they didn't know a word, a single word, they would often, I'll come to this a bit later, but translate around it and then see if they could work out the meaning of the word. Next to that was, if they don't think in Japanese, they couldn't understand the contents. And this came out very strongly in my interviews. Especially the lower level students really felt that unless they could think it through in Japanese, it just hadn't gone into their heads. Oh, sorry, I've gone ahead too fast. Next to that, to check they understood correctly what they have read, to go back to make sure that they were really right the first time. Also, when they came across the same word they didn't know several times, and that was really bugging them. And when the grammar was difficult, to help them understand. Again, a lot of students in the interviews said that even when high-level students would find that, for example, a conditional sentence or past perfect sentence with a sequence of tenses, they have to think through the time sequence. It helped them to think it through in Japanese. The least common reason was that English is not their mother tongue, so when they saw a word, the Japanese just came into their head. This was included because it was one of the responses from our pilot survey, and also, interestingly, this came up in my interviews quite a lot, that you can't switch off your L1. It just automatically jumps in, subconsciously. So we need psycholinguists to research this a bit more. It's beyond my field. 141 students, good for them, said they didn't translate. But a very small number if you consider that it was, the sample size was 264, plus they could check multiple answers if more than one answer applied to them. Okay, second part of the research project. So to find out in more detail and to understand better what is going on the heads of the readers, I carried out interviews with 30 volunteers from the same cohort of students. So my methodology, they were given a reading comprehension exercise individually. So they would come in to me one at a time. This was the opening pages, about 700 words, of one of the 4 graded readers deemed to be appropriate level. I deemed their appropriate level by asking them to read aloud to me, first of all. And I listened very carefully and made a guesstimate as to their level. I didn't ask them which class they were in, which course they were taking. I didn't want that to prejudice me in any way. And I didn't know any of the students. So one or two times I did mess up. One student came in and said, "Oh, I'm really glad to meet you. I spent some time in the UK." And I thought, so I immediately, in my mind, put her at a higher level than she really was. But anyway, it was a very rough and ready way of calculating, but I needed a base point. So they were given a text to read silently, and And then after that, I asked them to use a highlighter and to mark the places on the text where they had translated into Japanese or stopped and thought it through in Japanese. And then after that, during the course of our conversation about extensive reading, their reading habits, I went through the passage with them and asked them to explain what was going on in each of the places that they had highlighted. And then after that, I transcribed and analysed the data. Okay, I think that covers that slide. So just to give you an idea of who these volunteers were, 17 male, 13 female. They weren't in my classes. They came from these departments. 18 in foreign languages. They weren't English majors. They were studying Spanish, Italian, French, Russian, Indonesian, etc., Chinese. Yeah. For some reason, the language students are more interested in taking part in this kind of research. The reading levels of the students, I was really lucky. I got this nice bell curve. A lot of them were average. Now, this is the Kyoto Sangyo University reading level. So our reading level 5 corresponds to CFR A2. Yeah, so 4 and 5 were sort of A1, A2. 3, 4, 5, A1, A2. And then 6 and 7 would be B1, 8 and 9 would be B2. If you're familiar with, I don't know how you think about reading levels, but for me the CFR banding is quite helpful. Has this method been used before for investigating extensive readers? I don't think so. I haven't come across it in any of the literature. I came across a couple of studies by Davis and Bistodeau in 1993 and Kern in 1994 who were looking at students who, and it was more of an intensive reading situation. And they used read aloud protocols. So what happens is the students are reading a passage which is quite difficult, and as they are reading, they are thinking aloud to the researcher. And so they're actually talking through their process of reading. So they're reading a bit and, oh, I don't understand this word, I better go back and check what I just read in the line before. That kind of process. I didn't feel this was suitable for the extensive reading experience. So I decided to go with the reading it once through and then go through again and highlight. So the materials I used 4 texts at 4 levels. I'm being a bit cagey about the publishers because I'm a little bit critical about some of the texts. It will emerge from a little bit later. So as I say, there were A1, A2, I've taken that sideways, B1, B2. But they were roughly around the right level for the students I was interviewing. The A1 text was by publisher A because it was below the level produced by the other publisher. And then the other 3 were by the same publisher. They were used because none of them were actually in our program at that time. So what emerged from the interviews is that there seem to be 4 groups of reasons why the students are translating. The first, for me, most interesting, that needs much more research but on my part, is the role of the L1 when thinking. As a language learner myself, I'm very aware of when I'm thinking in English, trying to work out what people are saying to me in other languages or what I'm reading in another language. And so I know where the students are coming from. And I think many people in the audience, everyone here, knows where the students are coming from, the role of the L1. The second group of reasons were deliberate strategies being employed by the students, conscious strategies, to aid their comprehension. The third group of reasons were language-related reasons, basically where their language level was below the level of the reading text. But also, just they haven't had enough practice in certain grammatical structures or in the vocabulary that they were coming across. And the fourth group of reasons were related to the contents and the style of the text, the readability of the text itself. I'm going to be talking about this reason tomorrow in the readability colloquium. So I don't want to spend too much time on that today. So first of all, the role of the L1 when thinking. The lower level students felt they couldn't understand if they didn't think in Japanese. So I've included the Japanese in Romaji, but I'll just read the English. In all of these examples, A is me. I'm Amanda. Okay, so the student said, it won't go into my head. I asked, it won't go into your head? And I'm not confident about the meaning. Okay, and another student said, if I don't translate, I can't grasp the contents. You don't have much confidence? If it's only in English, it's a bit... ... which is better, to translate or to read directly in English? I prefer to translate. Yeah. But reliance on the L1 for thinking is not just related to the level of the L2. A higher level student reported that Japanese comes into their mind first, subconsciously. It seems difficult to switch off the L1 at times. This student said, if something doesn't come into mind immediately, I end up translating. I said, I see. You translated. How about fields? Didn't you know this word either? I knew it, but the Japanese came to mind first. So for some irritating reason for her, just the Japanese came into her head. A few more examples. A student said, when I'm reading something easy in English, the Japanese translation comes into my head simultaneously. Again, not able to switch off the L1. So I said, I see. If it's complicated, I go back. I said, yes, so you don't read directly in English? That's right. You are translating into Japanese all the time. I'm translating most of the time. Poor thing. No wonder they say extensive reading is very time-consuming and very tiring. Yeah. 4 lower-level students reported they needed to think in Japanese to get an image in their head. That's to understand the scene and the action. And interestingly, a higher level student reported that she creates an image in her mind as she reads, but she's not sure if she thinks in English or Japanese. She really didn't know. She just had this image of what she'd been reading, but she couldn't tell me if she'd been thinking in either language, which language. In my head there's a picture. I don't know if I'm translating to Japanese, but I can see an image. So translating gives confidence and a sense of security. Thinking sentence by sentence increases their confidence in understanding. Here I am actually paraphrasing what a number of students reported. They worry that if they skip a part they don't understand, they will not be able to follow the story. I explained a little earlier how important it is for them to get the story. There's a lot hanging on it. They feel confident that they understood the English if they can translate it into Japanese. This is like a trophy, badge of honor. Yes, I understood the English because I can translate it into Japanese. And many prefer to translate if they have time to do so. It's just kind of this reassurance, they got it. Translating or thinking Japanese as a strategy to aid comprehension. So now we're getting on to where they're using this deliberately. They translate parts they understand to try to understand an unknown part. A lot of the more high-level students were talking about this, the middle level and the higher level students. They're actually actively using what they know to work out what they don't know. I suspect that one or two cases I'd given them something that was a little bit difficult for them. It wasn't actually what they would be normally reading on the extensive reading program. Thinking in Japanese helps when a key word is unknown. Again, if they can understand most of it in Japanese, if they've got the idea, then they can make that leap into the unknown to guess the missing word. And then the higher level students say they read in English and translate consciously or subconsciously the parts they don't understand. Some students, it was very curious, they have a habit of automatically translating certain words. And it seems a lot of them built up this habit when they were preparing for entrance exams or for high school English exams. And certain words and constructions and verb tenses, etc. And in fact, the highest level reader of all that I interviewed says that he regularly translates past conditionals and difficult verb tenses like that. Two students said that they were taught to do this by their teachers. I was expecting more of the students to say that the teachers had taught them to translate, because I do have a rather negative impression of the way that English is being taught in high schools in Japan, and I'm in the process of finding out more about what's going on at the moment. But a lot of students I expected to say that their teachers had taught them to translate. In fact, they didn't say, and one of them said that it was their own habit that they had developed. Thinking and translating helps them to grasp important aspects of the story, especially to help remember all the characters. A lot of the readers have a lot of characters, and again, if they're thinking in their L1, it helps them to get a grip on who is who, and especially for understanding the conversations. They recognise that in the fiction, the conversations are often key to the development of the plot, and if they understand the conversations, then they feel prepared to understand what's coming up. Also, to check their understanding when something unexpected happens in the story. And this can be an event or action, an action by a character or an event in the story, and it can be related to cultural differences. And this has a lot to do with the way the reader is written, the book is written, the writing style. And but this was the most common reason that was given by students for stopping and thinking in Japanese and going back. When they're reading the story and suddenly, what's going on? It must be my English. I didn't understand what was happening because of my English. But in fact, it's the way that the story was being told. The narrative flow jumped into, it actually jumped, in one story, it jumped into reverse. It was a flashback. But the flashback wasn't introduced as a flashback. And the students were, what's going on? What's going on? What have I missed? Yeah. So I think we need to look very closely at the way the readers are being written. I won't go through these in detail, but these are the main reasons, language reasons, related to the readability of the texts. Pronouns are immensely difficult for Japanese readers of English. Syntax, vocabulary, phrasal verbs are very hard. And the problem with phrasal verbs in readers that are measured by the number of head words is that very often the two parts of the phrasal verb are within the head word count, but combined the meaning is opaque to the readers. Idiomatic English, I'll give some examples in detail tomorrow, and I've got a few examples I think coming up. Metaphorical language is really hard. And also there was use of onomatopoeia, a word that isn't really a word, but it just sounds like the sound. And none of the students knew what that meant. And why put that into a graded reader? It's just not necessary. And long, difficult sentences. By difficult sentences, I mean complex sentences with embedded clauses. The students had to really go back and process their kit. There may be some things which are very obvious to readers from a certain background, but not obvious to readers from a different background. And it was a British publication that I used, and something that was very obvious to Europeans and to British people was, what's this? What's going on for the Japanese readers? Last of all, in the readers, even the lowest level reader I used, which was pre-A1, the students were expected to infer meaning from the text. The sentences were very short, very simple, but they had to infer the character and the personality, the motivation of the character in the story. And they weren't used to doing this. And they expected just to be given the information. But having to infer, especially at a very low level, was very difficult for them. So what do we do about this as teachers? We teachers cannot and should not command our students to switch off their L1. But we can persuade them of the benefits of minimizing their use of the L1. First, the golden rule: check that students are reading books at the right level. In our program, the students are very tempted to try to read books at a higher level because the higher level books have more words and they have to read fewer words to reach their target. It's a bigger bang for the buck. Yeah. So we really want to make sure that they're not trying to overstretch themselves. Second, choose books with glossaries and a lot of helpful illustrations. The students rely a lot on the illustrations. When I was going through the text with them and asking them, did the picture help you to understand this? Yes, it did. Sometimes the pictures are not very attractive, but they are a very useful tool for the students, and they are relying on them. And quite often, in the story that I mentioned just now, where there was a flashback to the past, that story actually begins, it's in a train. And the first line, the main character is sitting in the train and describing the scenery as it goes past, flashes past the train. But there's no explanation to the reader that this is the case. If they'd had a simple illustration of a young man sitting in a train looking out of the window, the students would have understood. So it's really important for the publishers to think so carefully about what they're illustrating. Check the age group the stories are aimed at. I'm currently researching with junior and senior high students, and it's really difficult to find good readers in our library, but we're using quite a wide range of readers, which the content matches the high level of junior high school students. You find that as you go up the level of the readers, then the content gets more and more adult. And when I was doing the same thing with a junior high student who was actually a very fluent reader, the story was about a young couple who just got married who were looking at houses. Now, for us, yes, this is right what we're used to and you can talk about, but for junior high, what's they talking about? Why are they talking about this? You know, this is another big important factor. Check the use of idiomatic language in the readers. I was horrified when going through this reader with a student by a very highly reputable publisher that there were so many opaque idiomatic language expressions that could have been avoided. They didn't need to be there in the reader. I'll talk about this more tomorrow. Avoid books with a lot of characters, especially with difficult names. Point out that reading directly in English is faster and more fun. Suggest skipping unknown words to see how much they can still understand. And encourage students to scan long sentences or difficult passages and then reread in English to check their understanding. Now, I don't want to embarrass the person in question, but I was absolutely thrilled when I was interviewing a very low-level student, and when we went through it, she had marked almost nothing as having translated into English, and I was fascinated. And I said, wow, you did really well. You didn't translate into Japanese. Sorry, you didn't think in Japanese. And I said, have you done that all year? And she said, no. She said, at first I was translating a lot, but my teacher told me not to translate, but to reread in English. A teacher sitting in the room, but I won't embarrass her. And I was so happy. And so I'd like to pass on this advice to everyone. Final suggestions. Do not assume that all students are familiar with basic plot structures. Many students I interviewed and that we surveyed stopped reading fiction in junior or senior high. In Japan is the case. I don't know about Korea, but I've been talking to people who are working in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, and they say that reading is not what people do. And so they're not very sophisticated readers. In Japan, often they love reading when they're in elementary school and they're encouraged to read a lot. They get into junior high, and some junior highs do have a reading session every day. But by the time they're in senior high, they are so geared up to entrance exam work. They're so busy with cram school. In addition, they're not reading. And so Farrell, his book, it's on my on the list of references. He has a very good book with lots of practical advice, and he suggests teaching the students story grammars, helping them to understand how stories are structured. And you needn't do this by using books. You can use comic books if that's what the students read. You can use movies or cartoons, animation, stories that the students are familiar with and that they can then retell and then think for themselves about the plot, the structure of the plot of the stories they're familiar with. And this will help them when they're reading those readers that maybe haven't been edited so closely for a nice sequential plot structure. Closing words. One of my interviewees said that translating to Japanese is not good because English is not Japanese, also Japanese is not English. He went on to say that by translating, one can understand the story, but this does not mean that one can understand the English. Translating doesn't help improve one's English understanding. This student wants to be able to read and understand directly in English. I hope his insights will encourage your students to do the same. And postscript. When do students stop translating a lot and start reading directly in English? My second research question, the Holy Grail. Through my interviews, I found out that mostly they stopped doing this in the fall semester, so their second semester of extensive reading, and it happened gradually and naturally. Most of them, when they reached about our level 5, about CFR A2, 900 to 1,100 head words. For those of you teaching younger learners or junior high, it feels like a long way to go. But I'm researching this further now with junior and senior high teachers. I'm hoping to be able to refine. Yeah. That's all from me. I think we might have a minute or two for questions. Yes, let's go.
Yes. Thank you very much for very interesting research. And I have never thought that the students were translating so much. Because I tell my students, especially right after the entrance exam, they have the translation habit, written translation habit. So to get rid of translation habit, I give them 100 very easy books. So read until Japanese does not come out of your mind.
Yeah.
So I thought they were doing without Japanese translation.
Maybe your students are. What I ought to say is these students, now the teacher I mentioned is a very, very enthusiastic teacher and a believer in extensive reading, but most of the other teachers that I interviewed, who were teaching the students I interviewed, were doing very little to support the extensive reading. This was done as an out-of-class activity. And so the students were actually getting very little instruction on how to go about extensive reading. So this data is based on mostly on students who are left to their own devices. So what I should have added there, another point for teachers, yeah, teach them how to do extensive reading. Yes.
One more question. As you said, they might be the reason that they have to take the Moodle test.
Yes.
Then if that is true, the Moodle test can be a washback of the reading.
Yes. 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 I work with Tom, and we, as researchers, we should have our doubts about our system and see the weaknesses in our system. At the same time, the students have said to me, in the first set of interviews I did 2 years ago, one of my questions was, when you reached your goal, did you carry on reading? And to a person, they said, no. I reached my goal. I've got other things to do. And so our students are not reading for the fun of reading, for the pleasure of reading. They're reading because they see it as part of a course. And when we ask them about flow, I didn't bring that data today because it's not related to this talk, but the flow results show that no. Then most of the time they're very conscious that they're doing this as study and not reading for pleasure and enjoyment. There are students who really get into the reading, but again, the one student who I interviewed who was really an excellent reader and had read voraciously, he said that no, once he reached the target, that's enough. He was satisfied to reach the target, and it still felt like it was study and not something that he did for pleasure. Okay, I think we have to stop. I'll take questions afterwards informally, but I think there's going to be someone else who's going to talk here. So I'd be very happy to answer your question in a minute. Okay, thank you.